The wild Mustang appeared on the ridge at dawn like a ghost made flesh, his coat the color of storm clouds and his eyes holding the kind of wildness that could never be tamed. Beneath the vast Colorado sky, the stallion stood proud with a dappled mare at his side, and Willow Parker watched from her kitchen window as the pair made their way down the rocky slope toward her fence line with a purpose that sent her heart racing. She had been living alone on the small ranch outside Palisade, Colorado, for 3 months now, ever since her father had passed from pneumonia during the bitter winter of 1884. The spring of 1885 had brought new grass and wildflowers to the high desert valley, but it had also brought a loneliness that settled into her bones like the cold never had. At 22 years old, Willow had inherited 200 acres of scrubland, a dozen head of cattle, and a determination to prove she could manage on her own despite what the townspeople whispered behind their hands. The Mustang and his mare reached the fence and stopped, the stallion tossing his magnificent head as if calling out to something beyond the wooden rails. Willow set down her coffee cup and stepped out onto the porch, her breath catching as she saw what had drawn them. One of her own mares, a sweet-natured bay named Clover, stood on the other side of the fence with her ears pricked forward, nickering softly to the wild horses. "Well, I'll be," Willow murmured, watching the interaction with fascination. The wild stallion was clearly trying to convince his mare to stay close while also investigating this new horse who smelled of grain and human touch. The dappled mare seemed torn between her loyalty to the stallion and her curiosity about the domestic horse and the ranch beyond. The sound of hoofbeats on hard, packed earth made Willow turn, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle she kept by the door. Living alone had taught her caution, but when she saw the lone rider approaching, something in her chest eased even as her pulse quickened for an entirely different reason. The man sat tall in his saddle, his dark hair visible beneath a worn Stetson, and even from a distance, she could see the easy confidence in the way he moved with his horse. He was leading a pack mule behind him, and as he drew closer, Willow could make out the strong lines of his jaw and the intensity of his gaze fixed on the wild horses at her fence. "Morning," he called out when he was close enough, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed at odds with the careful way he approached, as if he did not want to spook either the wild horses or her. "Name's Dalton Drake. I've been tracking that Mustang for near about 2 weeks now." Willow stepped off the porch, brushing her hands against her worn skirt. "You a Mustanger?" Dalton swung down from his saddle with a fluid grace that spoke of years in the saddle, and Willow found herself taking in details. She had no business noticing the breadth of his shoulders beneath his dusty shirt, the way his brown eyes held flecks of gold in the morning light, the slight smile that curved his lips as he shook his head. "Not exactly," he said, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "I work for the Double Bar Ranch about 15 miles north. That mare with the stallion, she belonged to us. Got swept up by this particular Mustang about 3 weeks back during a storm. My boss sent me to bring her home, but that stallion's been leading me on quite the chase." Willow looked back at the wild horses, seeing the way the stallion kept himself between Dalton and his mare, protective and fierce. "He loves her." "Seems that way," Dalton agreed, his voice softening. "Makes my job a fair bit harder when there's genuine affection involved. Can't quite bring myself to just rope her and drag her away from him." Something in those words made Willow's opinion of this stranger shift and settle into something warmer than mere caution. "What's your plan, then?" Dalton was quiet for a moment, studying the horses with the kind of patience Willow recognized from her own father. "Been trying to figure that out. The Double Bar wants their mare back. She's got good bloodlines, worth a fair penny. but I've been around horses my whole life, and there's something about breaking up a bonded pair that sits wrong in my gut." "Could you buy her from them?" Willow heard herself ask. "Keep them together." Dalton's laugh was rueful. "On a ranch hand's wages. I've got about $40 to my name, and most of that's owed at the general store." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Willow felt the weight of his attention like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Forgive me, I didn't catch your name." "Willow Parker. This is my land was my father's before he passed." She gestured toward the modest ranch house and the weathered barn beyond. "Just me here now and what stock I've got left." Understanding flickered in Dalton's eyes, followed by something that might have been respect. "Sorry for your loss. Can't be easy, running a place this size alone." "I manage," Willow said, lifting her chin in that way she had when anyone questioned her capability. "Been managing just fine." "I don't doubt it," Dalton said, and the sincerity in his voice made her relax slightly. "Miss Parker, would you mind if I made camp nearby for a spell? I'd like to spend some time with these horses, see if I can't figure out a solution that doesn't involve separating them or returning to the double bar empty-handed." Willow knew she should say no. Knew that letting a strange man stay on her property, even one with kind eyes and gentle hands with horses, was the kind of thing that could ruin her reputation faster than a prairie fire. But something in her, that part that had watched her father treat both animals and people with compassion, made her nod. "There's a spot near the creek with good grass for your horse and mule," she said. "I expect you'll keep your distance and conduct yourself properly." "Yes, madam," Dalton said, and the formality of it was undercut by the warmth in his smile. "I appreciate the hospitality. I'll earn my keep. Anything you need fixed or mended, I'm handy with tools." Over the next 3 days, Willow found her carefully constructed solitude invaded by Dalton's presence, in ways both frustrating and thrilling. He was true to his word about keeping his distance, making his camp a respectful quarter-mile from her house, but he was also true to his word about being handy. She would wake to find her fence repaired where it had been sagging, or return from checking on her cattle to discover he had reshod her mare with quiet efficiency. The wild Mustang and his stolen mate remained near the fence line, and Willow watched from her porch each evening as Dalton sat on the ground a good 30 feet from the fence, just being present with the horses. He never pushed forward, never tried to approach or capture. He simply existed in their space, letting them grow accustomed to him. On the 4th morning, Willow brought coffee and biscuits down to where Dalton sat watching the sunrise paint the mountains pink and gold. He looked surprised when she settled onto the ground beside him, careful to keep a proper distance between them, but he accepted the food with genuine gratitude. "Thank you," he said, wrapping his hands around the tin cup as if the warmth of it was precious. "You make good coffee." "My father taught me," Willow said. "Said life was too short for weak coffee and weak convictions." Dalton smiled at that. Sounds like he was a wise man. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the wild stallion led his mare down to drink from the creek while Clover paced along the fence line, clearly conflicted about the wild horses so near yet out of reach. "Can I ask you something?" Willow finally said, her curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. "Anything." "Why does it matter so much to you? The horses, I mean. Most men would have just roped that mare and been done with it days ago." Dalton was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "When I was 15, my older brother caught and broke a Mustang mare. Prettiest paint horse you ever saw, but he broke her spirit in the breaking. She was never right after that, would do what you asked, but there was no life in her eyes. She died a few years later, and I always felt like we killed something essential in her when we took away her wildness." He looked at Willow then, and she saw old pain in his eyes. "I swore I'd never do that to another horse if I could help it. There's ways to gentle a horse without breaking them, and sometimes the kindest thing is to let them keep their freedom. Even if it costs you your job, even then," Dalton said firmly. "Some things matter more than money or employment." Willow found herself drawn to this man who valued the spirit of wild things, who saw beyond the immediate profit to the deeper rightness of a situation. What if there was another way? "What do you mean?" "Your boss wants his mare back because she's valuable, right? Good bloodlines." When Dalton nodded, Willow continued, thinking out loud. "What if you could offer him something else of value, not the mare herself, but something that would make up for the loss? Like what? I told you I don't have much money. What if we caught the Mustang?" Willow said slowly, the plan forming even as she spoke. Not to sell or break, but to offer him to the double bar as a stud. Wild Mustang blood would strengthen their herd, and a stallion of his quality would be worth more than one mare. They could lease him out to other ranches, make a good profit. Dalton stared at her, hope and skepticism warring in his expression. "You think we could catch him without ruining him?" "I think if anyone could, it might be you," Willow said honestly. "I've watched you with those horses. You've got patience most men don't have." "We'd need to build a trap pen," Dalton said, his mind clearly working through the logistics. "Something strong enough to hold him but not so confining it makes him panic. And then we'd need to gentle him enough that I could lead him back to the ranch without him fighting every step." "I've got timber we could use," Willow offered. "And I could help. I'm stronger than I look, and I know horses well enough." Dalton met her eyes, and something passed between them in that moment. Something that had nothing to do with horses or plans and everything to do with the way his gaze made her heart beat faster. "Why would you help me? You don't owe me anything." "Maybe I believe in what you're trying to do," Willow said softly. "Or maybe I'm tired of being alone out here and could use a project that's bigger than just surviving day to day." The honesty of her words hung in the air between them, and Willow felt suddenly vulnerable in a way she had not allowed herself to feel since her father's death. But Dalton did not look away or make light of her admission. Instead, he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull back, and touched her hand where it rested on her knee. "Then let's give it a try," he said. "Together." They spent the next week building the trap pen in a natural hollow near the creek, using the terrain to help funnel the horses toward the enclosure. Willow worked alongside Dalton from sunrise to sunset, measuring and cutting and hauling timber until her muscles ached and her hands were raw despite her gloves. But there was something deeply satisfying about the physical labor, and even more satisfying about the easy partnership that developed between them. Dalton never talked down to her or suggested she should leave the heavy work to him. Instead, he treated her as an equal, asking her opinion on placement and design, teaching her tricks for sinking posts in the rocky soil, and accepting her help with the kind of natural grace that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. They talked as they worked, sharing stories of their lives in the easy way of people who find themselves unexpectedly compatible. Willow learned that Dalton was 26, originally from Texas, and had been working ranches since he was old enough to sit a horse. He had a younger sister back in Austin who was married to a shopkeeper, and he sent money home when he could to help with their aging mother. In turn, Willow told him about growing up on the ranch, about her mother who had died when she was 12, about her father's patient teaching and his belief that a person's word was their bond. She told him about the loneliness of the past 3 months, the way the silence of the house sometimes felt like it would swallow her whole, and the bone-deep determination to prove she could make it on her own. "You've already proved that," Dalton said one afternoon as they took a break in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "Look at what you've accomplished. This place is well maintained, your stock is healthy, and you haven't given up despite having every reason to." "Sometimes I want to," Willow admitted, surprising herself with the confession. "Some nights I lie awake and think about selling, moving to town, maybe finding work as a seamstress or a teacher. It would be easier." "Would it make you happy?" Willow thought about that, really thought about it. "No," she finally said. "I love this land. Love the smell of it after rain, the way the mountains look in the morning light, the feeling of being part of something bigger than myself. But it's hard doing it alone." Dalton was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Doesn't have to be alone forever, though. Could find yourself a partner someday. Someone who'd see your strength and admire it instead of trying to diminish it." There was something in the way he said it, looking at her with those warm brown eyes, that made Willow's breath catch. But before she could respond, the wild Mustang appeared at the creek, and the moment passed as they both fell silent, watching the magnificent animal drink his fill. By the end of the week, the trap pen was finished, a solid corral with high walls and a gate that could be triggered from a distance using a rope system Dalton had devised. Now came the harder part, convincing the horses to enter it. "We'll need to bait them," Dalton said, studying their handiwork. "Make it appealing enough that they'll want to investigate." They started by putting fresh hay and grain inside the pen, leaving the gate open and making no attempt to interact with the horses when they came to investigate. The first day, the Mustang circled the structure warily, keeping his mare well back. The second day, he approached close enough to sniff at the entrance. By the third day, his mare had ventured inside to sample the grain while he stood watch. "We're close," Dalton said that evening as he and Willow sat on her porch watching the sunset. It had become their ritual, this evening time together, and Willow found herself looking forward to it with an anticipation that had nothing to do with horses and everything to do with the man beside her. "What happens after?" Willow asked. "After we catch him and you take him to the double bar?" Dalton was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose I'll go back to ranch work, though I've been thinking maybe it's time for a change." "What kind of change?" He turned to look at her, and in the golden light of sunset, Willow thought she had never seen a man look quite so handsome or quite so serious. "The kind where I stop drifting from ranch to ranch and put down roots somewhere. Find a place I could call home, maybe with someone who'd want to build that home with me." Willow's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Dalton, I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "I know we've only known each other a week and a half. But Willow, I've never felt this way before. Being here with you, working beside you, talking with you, it feels right in a way nothing else ever has. You're strong and smart and beautiful, and when I think about riding away from here and never seeing you again, it makes my chest hurt." "Then don't," Willow heard herself say. "Don't ride away." "You mean that?" "I mean I've felt the same way," Willow said, the words tumbling out now that she had started. "Every evening I tell myself I should maintain proper distance, should remember you're just here temporarily. But then you look at me the way you're looking at me right now, and all I can think is that I don't want you to be temporary. I want—" She broke off, suddenly shy despite her boldness. "What do you want?" Dalton asked softly, shifting closer to her on the porch step. "I want you to stay," Willow whispered. "I want to see where this goes, whatever this is between us. I want to wake up and see you working in the barn, want to spend evenings talking with you, want—" She stopped again, overwhelmed by the intensity of her own feelings. Dalton reached out and cupped her face gently in his work-roughened hand. "Can I kiss you?" Willow nodded, not trusting her voice, and then his lips were on hers, and the whole world seemed to narrow down to the warmth of his mouth, the gentleness of his touch. the way her whole body seemed to come alive under his attention. It was her first real kiss, and it was everything she had imagined and more, sweet and tender and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "I'm not a rich man, Willow. I've got my horse and my gear and not much else to my name. But I'm a hard worker and I'd treat you right. If you'll have me, I'd like to stay here, help you run this ranch and court you proper-like." "Yes," Willow said, smiling so wide her face hurt. "Yes to all of that." They sat together on the porch until the stars came out, holding hands and making quiet plans for a future that felt suddenly bright with possibility. Dalton talked about improvements they could make to the ranch, ways to expand the herd and maybe start breeding horses. Willow shared her dream of planting an orchard, taking advantage of the good soil near the creek. They were dreams that wove together naturally, each supporting and enhancing the other, and Willow felt a contentment settle into her bones that had been missing since her father's death. The next morning they woke to find both the wild Mustang and his mare inside the trap pen, peacefully eating hay. Dalton gripped Willow's hand tight as they approached cautiously, hardly daring to breathe. "Easy now," Dalton murmured, though whether to Willow or the horses she was not sure. He moved toward the rope that would trigger the gate, his movements slow and deliberate. On three, 1, 2, 3. The gate swung closed with a solid thunk, and for a moment everything was still. Then the Mustang screamed, a sound of rage and fear that made Willow's heart clench. He reared up, striking at the air, and his mare pressed herself against the far wall of the pen, eyes rolling white with panic. "It's all right," Dalton said, his voice calm and steady despite the chaos. "Let them be. They need to settle, figure out they're not in immediate danger." It took every ounce of Willow's willpower not to open the gate and release them. The Mustang's distress felt like a physical thing, battering against her chest. But she trusted Dalton's experience, trusted the patience he had shown from the beginning. They spent the rest of that day, and the next simply being present near the pen, sitting quietly and letting the horses grow accustomed to their presence in this new context. Gradually, the Mustang's panic subsided into wary watchfulness, and his mare began eating again, accepting that for now at least they were trapped but not harmed. On the third day, Dalton entered the pen for the first time. Willow stood outside, her hands gripping the rails so tight her knuckles were white, watching as he approached the horses with the same patient calm he had shown throughout. The Mustang charged him once, a warning, but Dalton simply stepped aside and continued his slow approach. By the end of the week, Dalton could stand in the pen without the Mustang charging. By the end of the second week, he could touch the stallion's shoulder. And by the end of the third week, he had a rope halter on the proud animal and was leading him in circles around the pen while the Mustang's mare watched with pricked ears. "He's ready," Dalton said one morning as he and Willow shared coffee on her porch. "I need to take him to the double bar today, make my offer to the boss." Willow's heart sank despite knowing this moment had been coming. "I'll miss you." "I'll be back by nightfall," Dalton promised, pulling her close. "This is my home now, Willow. You're my home. Nothing's going to keep me away." But Willow could not shake the anxiety that settled over her as she watched Dalton lead the Mustang away, the stallion following with surprising docility given his wild nature. The mare they had released back into the pen with Clover, and she paced the fence line, calling after her mate with plaintive whinnies that echoed how Willow felt. The day dragged on endlessly. Willow threw herself into chores, mucking out stalls and mending tack and anything else she could think of to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling into worry. What if the double bar refused Dalton's offer? What if they insisted he return to work for them, move back into the bunkhouse, leave her ranch and her behind. What if the sound of hoofbeats in the late afternoon sent Willow running to the porch, her heart in her throat? But it was not Dalton returning. Instead, she saw 3 riders approaching, and something in the way they sat their horses, in the purposeful nature of their approach, set her nerves on edge. She reached for her rifle just as the men reined in near her porch. They were rough-looking, with several days of stubble on their faces and hard eyes that swept over her property with assessing gazes. "Help you gentlemen?" Willow asked, keeping her voice steady despite her racing pulse. The man in the center, older than the other 2 with a scar running down his left cheek, smiled in a way that made Willow's skin crawl. "We're looking for a man named Dalton Drake. Heard he's been staying around these parts. What business do you have with him?" "That's between us and him," the scarred man said. "Now, you going to tell us where he is, or do we need to look around ourselves?" Willow raised the rifle slightly, making sure they saw it. "I'm going to ask you to leave my property. Whatever business you have with anyone, you can conduct it in town like civilized people." One of the other men, younger and meaner looking, laughed. "Got some spine on her, doesn't she?" "Maybe we should. Maybe you should listen to the lady," a voice said from behind them, and Willow's heart leaped as she saw Dalton riding up, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "And then maybe you should ride on out of here before this gets unpleasant." The scarred man turned his horse to face Dalton. "Drake, been looking for you. Found me, Hayes. Now what do you want?" "You know what we want. You took something that belongs to us." Dalton's expression hardened. "I didn't take anything. That horse you're talking about was wild caught, and I brought him into the double bar as payment for a debt. Everything was done legal and proper." Hayes spat on the ground. "That Mustang was ours. We'd been tracking him for a month before you showed up and stole him right out from under us." "Mustangs don't belong to anybody until they're caught," Dalton said evenly. "And like I said, he's at the double bar now. You've got a problem with that, take it up with them." "Or we could take it up with you," the younger man said, his hand drifting toward his gun. Everything happened fast after that. Willow saw the young man's hand move and raised her rifle even as Dalton's hand went to his gun. But before anyone could draw, a shot rang out from the direction of the barn, kicking up dirt between the horses and causing all 3 of the strangers' mounts to shy and dance. "I believe the lady asked you to leave," a new voice called out, and Willow saw old Tom Hendricks, a neighboring rancher she knew slightly, standing by the barn with a rifle in his hands. "And I believe the gentleman backed her up. So unless you boys want this to escalate into something you'll regret, I suggest you move along." Hayes stared at them all for a long moment, his jaw working with suppressed anger, but he was not stupid enough to push the situation with 3 guns against his 3. "This isn't over, Drake." "Yeah, it is," Dalton said quietly. "Whatever you think you're owed, you're not getting it. Move on." The 3 men wheeled their horses and rode off, kicking up dust in their wake. Willow did not lower her rifle until they were well out of sight, and even then her hands were shaking. Dalton dismounted and was at her side in an instant, pulling her into his arms. "You're all right. I've got you." "Who were they?" Willow asked, her face pressed against his chest. "Mustangers out of Denver," Dalton said grimly. "Bad sorts who run horses hard and sell them to the highest bidder without caring what happens to the animals. They've been operating in this territory for a few months, and I ran into them once before when I kept them from taking a mare with a foal. Guess they decided to hold a grudge." Tom Hendricks approached, lowering his rifle. "Saw those fellows riding past my place this morning with purpose in their step. Figured I'd follow and make sure they weren't causing trouble." He nodded to Willow. "Your father was a good man, Miss Parker. Helped me out more than once." Least I could do is return the favor." "Thank you, Mr. Hendricks," Willow said sincerely. "I'm grateful for your timing." After Tom had left, promising to keep an eye out for any more trouble, Willow and Dalton sat on the porch as the sun set, closer than propriety strictly allowed but too shaken to care. "The double bar accepted my offer," Dalton said quietly. "Took one look at that Mustang, and agreed he was worth more as a stud than the mare was as breeding stock. They also agreed to let me keep working as an independent contractor rather than a full-time hand, which means I can stay here and help you run your ranch while still earning money from them when they need extra help." "That's wonderful," Willow said, but her voice was hollow. "Dalton, those men, I know," he said, tightening his arm around her shoulders. "I brought trouble to your door and I'm sorry for that." "That's not what I meant," Willow said. "I meant what if they come back? What if next time Mr. Hendricks isn't around to help?" Dalton was quiet for a long moment. "Then we'll handle it together. Willow, I'm not going to lie and say there's no danger. This is hard country and there are hard men in it. But I promise you, I will do everything in my power to keep you safe. And maybe it's time we made this arrangement more official, so anyone who comes around knows you're not alone out here." Willow pulled back to look at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying marry me," Dalton said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know it's fast, and I know the traditional thing would be to court you for months first. But I also know I love you, Willow Parker. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you see the world. I love the life we could build together. And I want to make it official, want to stand beside you not just as a hired hand or a friend, but as your husband." Willow felt tears sting her eyes. "We've only known each other a month. I know, and if you need more time, I'll give it to you. But I also think sometimes you just know when something's right, and this feels right to me. Does it feel right to you?" Willow thought about the past month, about the way Dalton had slowly become essential to her daily life. She thought about the way he made her laugh, the way he listened when she talked, the way he treated her as an equal partner in every decision. She thought about the future stretching ahead of her and how much brighter it looked with him in it. "Yes," she said, smiling through her tears. "Yes, it feels right. Yes, I'll marry you." Dalton kissed her then, deep and sweet, and Willow felt like she was falling and flying all at the same time. When they finally broke apart, both grinning like fools, the stars were beginning to come out overhead. "How soon?" Willow asked. "I mean, when should we? As soon as we can get the circuit preacher out here," Dalton said. "No point waiting when we're both sure." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony in Willow's front yard, with Tom Hendricks and his wife serving as witnesses and a handful of neighboring ranchers in attendance. Willow wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and Dalton wore a new shirt he had bought in town with money from his payment from the double bar. The circuit preacher, a jovial man named Reverend Walsh, pronounced them husband and wife as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. When Dalton kissed his bride, the small gathering cheered, and Willow felt a happiness so complete it was almost frightening in its intensity. That night, in the room that had been Willow's alone for 3 months and her father's before that, Dalton made love to her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. He was patient with her inexperience, gentle when she needed him to be, and passionate in a way that set her blood on fire. Afterwards, lying tangled together in the sheets with the window open to let in the cool night air, Willow thought she had never been so content. "I love you," she whispered against his chest. "I love you too," Dalton murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. "My beautiful wife." The months that followed were the happiest of Willow's life. True to his word, Dalton threw himself into helping run the ranch with the same dedication he had shown in gentling the Mustang. Together they repaired fences, branded calves, and prepared for the coming winter. Dalton took on additional work at the double bar a few days each month, bringing in money that they saved carefully against future needs. The Mustang thrived in his new role at the double bar, siring several foals that showed promise of inheriting his spirit and strength. The ranch foreman made it clear that Dalton's gentling method had resulted in a far more useful animal than breaking would have, and word began to spread about the young man who could gentle wild horses without destroying their essence. By autumn, other ranchers were bringing Dalton problem horses or wild-caught Mustangs, asking him to work his magic. He always brought them back to Willow's ranch to train, building additional corrals for the work, and soon they had a small but growing business in addition to their cattle operation. The mare that the original Mustang had stolen from the double bar eventually found her way into Willow and Dalton's possession when the ranch decided to sell off some of their stock. They bought her without hesitation, knowing the wild stallion and releasing her to join their growing herd. The reunion between stallion and mare was joyful to witness, and Dalton often talked about eventually breeding them, creating a line of horses that carried both wild spirit and domestic reliability. Hayes and his men never returned, though they heard rumors that the Mustangers had moved their operation north after running afoul of the law in Denver. Willow was grateful for the quiet, for the ability to build her life with Dalton without the shadow of threat hanging over them. When winter came, bringing snow to the high country and cold winds that howled through the valley, Willow discovered she was pregnant. She told Dalton on Christmas Eve as they sat before the fire, and the joy on his face was something she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "A baby," he kept saying, his hand resting reverently on her still flat belly. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Willow asked, though she could already see the answer in his expression. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Dalton said, pulling her into his arms. "You've given me everything I never knew I wanted: a home, a purpose, love, and now a child. I'm the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and into spring. Dalton became almost comically protective, insisting Willow avoid any heavy lifting and fussing over her constantly, until she finally had to sit him down and remind him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she was perfectly capable of continuing to work around the ranch within reason. "I know," Dalton said sheepishly. I can't stand the thought of anything happening to you or the baby." "Nothing's going to happen," Willow assured him, taking his hand and placing it on her belly where their child was now visibly moving. "We're both strong and healthy, and I've got you to take care of us. Everything is going to be fine." Their son was born on a beautiful morning in July of 1886, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. They named him Samuel Drake, after Dalton's father who had passed when Dalton was young. The boy had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and from the first moment Dalton held him, Willow knew their son would grow up knowing he was deeply loved. Tom Hendricks and his wife Martha became like surrogate grandparents to Samuel, stopping by often to check on the growing family and offer help when needed. Other neighboring ranchers proved equally supportive, and Willow felt herself becoming part of a community in a way she had not fully experienced even when her father was alive. The ranch prospered over the next few years. Their cattle herd grew, and Dalton's reputation as a horse gentler spread throughout western Colorado and beyond. They hired on a young ranch hand named Jessup to help with the daily work, allowing them more time to focus on the horse training that had become their specialty. When Samuel was 2, Willow became pregnant again, and this time they welcomed twin daughters into the world, Emma and Rose, named after both their grandmothers. The birth was harder than Samuel's had been, and for a few frightening hours Dalton had paced outside the bedroom door, listening to Willow's cries and feeling helpless. But Martha Hendricks, serving as midwife, knew her business, and eventually both babies arrived healthy and squalling. 3 children, Dalton said wonderingly that night, looking at his sleeping daughters in their shared cradle while Samuel dozed on a pallet nearby. "How did I get so blessed?" "We both did," Willow said from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "This is what family looks like." The children grew up surrounded by love and horses, learning to ride almost before they could walk. Samuel inherited his father's natural way with animals and his mother's determination, while Emma proved to be fearless and Rose more thoughtful and gentle. Together they were a force of nature, filling the ranch house with laughter and chaos in equal measure. When Samuel was 6, he was the one who spotted the familiar gray shape on the ridge one early morning. "Pa, Ma, come look." Willow and Dalton came running, and there on the ridge stood the wild Mustang who had started it all, now nearly 10 years old but still magnificent. Beside him stood his dappled mare and 3 younger horses that could only be their offspring. "He remembers," Willow said softly, watching as the Mustang tossed his head in that proud way she remembered from their first meeting. "After all these years, he still comes back sometimes." "Wild things don't forget kindness," Dalton said, wrapping an arm around her waist. "He knows this is a safe place." They watched as the Mustang family made their way down to the creek to drink, and then just as silently as they had come, they disappeared back into the wild country beyond the ranch. But they came back every few months, a reminder of where Willow and Dalton's story had begun, of the wild Mustang who had led his stolen mare to her fence line, and the cowboy who had followed and never left. Over the years, the ranch continued to grow and prosper. Samuel eventually took over much of the day-to-day cattle operation, showing a natural head for business along with his skill with horses. Emma married a neighboring rancher's son and started her own horse breeding program on land adjacent to her parents' property. Rose, always the most studious of the children, became a teacher in Palisade but lived at home, bringing books and learning to the ranch house. Willow and Dalton grew older together, their hair gaining silver threads and their faces gaining lines earned through years of laughter and work under the Colorado sun. But their love never diminished, never became routine or taken for granted. Every morning Dalton still kissed Willow before heading out to work, and every evening they still sat together on the porch watching the sunset, talking about their day and making plans for tomorrow. The wild Mustang continued to visit periodically until he was well into his 20s, ancient by horse standards. And then one year, he simply did not come back. His offspring sometimes appeared on the ridge, though, carrying on his legacy of wildness tempered by trust. When Willow turned 50, Dalton surprised her by taking her on a trip to Denver, their first real vacation since they had married. They stayed in a hotel with indoor plumbing and ate in restaurants with white tablecloths, and it was wonderful and strange and ultimately made them both appreciate their ranch life all the more. "I wouldn't trade our life for anything," Willow said on the train ride home, watching the familiar landscape of Colorado roll past. "Neither would I," Dalton agreed, taking her hand. "Every single day with you has been a gift." They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Samuel and his wife had given them 2 grandsons, Emma 3 granddaughters, and Rose had recently announced her engagement to the new doctor in town. The ranch house that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the sounds of family, and Willow looked around at all the lives that had sprung from that single moment when a wild Mustang had appeared on the ridge and led her to her future. "What are you thinking about?" Dalton asked, coming to stand beside her at the window where she was watching the children play in the yard. "How lucky I am," Willow said honestly. "That morning when I saw the Mustang at my fence, I had no idea my whole life was about to change." "Mine either," Dalton said, pulling her close. "I was just a drifter with no real home, no real purpose beyond the next job. You gave me everything that matters." "We gave each other everything," Willow corrected, turning to kiss him. "That's what love does." As they grew even older, their children took on more of the ranch work, but neither Willow nor Dalton could imagine fully retiring. The land was in their blood, the horses were their passion, and the life they had built together was too precious to step away from. They scaled back their operations somewhat, but they still woke each morning with purpose and went to bed each night satisfied with their day's work. On their 40th anniversary, the whole family gathered for a massive celebration. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren filled every corner of the ranch house and spilled out into the yard. Someone had strung up lanterns, and there was music and dancing and enough food to feed the entire county. As Dalton led Willow in a slow dance under the stars, she rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. 40 years, she murmured. "Where did the time go?" "Into this," Dalton said, gesturing around at their family, their land, the life they had created. "Every single moment well spent." "I love you," Willow said, the same words she had spoken thousands of times over their years together, but they never lost their meaning. "I love you too," Dalton replied, his voice as warm and sure as it had been on their wedding day. "Always have, always will." They danced until the moon was high, and their feet were tired, surrounded by love and light and the promise of tomorrow. In the distance, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the sound of wild horses running free across the high desert plains, a reminder that some things endure, that love born from kindness and respect grows only stronger with time, and that sometimes the best stories begin with a Mustang at a fence line and a cowboy brave enough to follow his heart. Samuel eventually took over as official owner of the ranch when Willow and Dalton reached their 60s, though they both remained active and involved in daily decisions. The horse gentling business that Dalton had started had become renowned throughout the West, with people bringing horses from as far away as California and Texas to be trained using his methods. He had written a small book about his techniques, emphasizing patience and respect over domination, and it had become something of a manual for progressive horse trainers throughout the territory. Emma's breeding program had produced several lines of horses that combined wild Mustang spirit with domestic reliability, exactly what Dalton had dreamed of years ago. Her horses were in high demand, and she had built her own successful operation while still maintaining close ties with her family's ranch. Rose's husband had built a practice in Palisade, and they had 4 children who spent their summers on the ranch, keeping the tradition alive for a new generation. Willow took up writing in her later years, documenting the history of the ranch and the early days of their settlement in Colorado. Her writings became treasured family heirlooms, passed down through generations, preserving not just the facts of their lives but the feelings and the meaning behind them. She wrote about the Mustang, of course, dedicating an entire chapter to the beautiful gray stallion who had changed their lives. But she also wrote about the smaller moments, the first time Dalton had taken her hand, the morning their first child was born, the quiet evenings spent on the porch watching the sun set over land they had tamed together. When they were in their late 60s, Dalton fell ill with pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. For several frightening weeks, Willow sat by his bedside, refusing to leave, holding his hand and willing him to fight. Their children took turns keeping vigil with her, and the whole family prayed for his recovery. He pulled through, though it took months for him to regain his full strength, and the experience left both of them shaken. They had always known intellectually that their time together was finite, but facing that reality so directly made every moment feel more precious. "I'm not ready to lose you," Willow whispered one night as they lay in bed, Dalton still weak but recovering. "You're not going to," Dalton said firmly. "I've got too much to live for to give up now. We've got grandchildren to watch grow up, and I intend to be around to teach every single one of them how to sit a horse properly." And true to his word, he recovered fully, though he was more careful after that, more willing to let others handle the heavy work and accept that his body was no longer as young as his spirit felt. But his mind remained sharp, and his heart remained full, and he and Willow settled into the comfortable rhythm of their later years with grace. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by 4 generations of family children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and even one great-great-grandchild, Samuel's first granddaughter having married young and started her own family. The ranch house could not hold everyone, so they set up tents in the yard and turned the whole property into a festival of family. During the celebration, Samuel presented his parents with a painting he had commissioned, a beautiful rendering of the gray Mustang and his dappled mare standing at the fence line with the mountains in the background. Willow cried when she saw it, and even Dalton had to wipe his eyes. "That's where it all started," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "That Mustang brought you together, Pa, and you built all of this." He gestured around at the gathered family. "Every single one of us exists because of that day, because of the choice you made to be patient and kind instead of just doing what was easiest. You taught us that some things are worth taking time for, worth doing right even when it's hard." "Your mother taught me that," Dalton said, pulling Willow close. "She saw a better way forward when I was ready to give up on those horses. She's been seeing better ways forward ever since." As the celebration continued into the night, Willow and Dalton slipped away to their favorite spot on the porch, watching the lantern light and listening to the sounds of their family's laughter and music. 50 years, Dalton mused. More than I ever dreamed I'd have, more than I ever deserved. "You deserved every moment," Willow said fiercely. "You're a good man, Dalton Drake, the best man I ever knew." "Because I found the best woman," Dalton countered. "You made me better, Willow, made me want to be better. I was drifting before I met you, no real direction or purpose. You gave me both. We gave each other everything we needed," Willow said, the same thing she had told him years before. "That's what real partnership looks like." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands clasped together, watching the stars come out one by one. In the distance, somewhere out in the darkness beyond the ranch lights, Willow thought she heard the call of a wild horse echoing across the valley. She smiled, thinking of the gray Mustang and his enduring legacy. "You have any regrets?" Dalton asked quietly. "Anything you wish had gone differently?" Willow thought about that seriously, reviewing the long years of their marriage, the challenges they had faced and overcome, the joys they had shared and the sorrows they had weathered together. "No," she finally said. "Not a single one. Even the hard times losing the cattle to that drought, the year the fire took the north pasture, the times when money was so tight we weren't sure we'd make it, even those times I wouldn't change. They made us stronger, taught us to rely on each other. Every moment brought us here to this place, this life, this family. How could I regret any of it?" That's how I feel too, Dalton said, relief evident in his voice. I just wanted to make sure I'd given you the life you deserved. You gave me the life I wanted, Willow corrected. There's a difference. I never wanted easy or comfortable or safe. I wanted real and meaningful and true. I wanted partnership and passion and purpose. You gave me all of that and more. They talked late into the night, reminiscing about their years together, the memories spilling out like treasures from an overflowing chest. They talked about the early days when every penny counted and every decision felt monumental. They talked about watching their children grow, the pride and the fear that came with seeing them become their own people with their own dreams. They talked about the horses they had gentled together, each one a unique challenge and a unique joy. Remember that paint mare who wouldn't let anyone touch her right ear, Dalton said, laughing at the memory. Took us 3 months to figure out she'd been hurt there as a foal and we needed to approach from the left. Or the gelding who was terrified of ropes after being dragged, Willow added. You spent weeks teaching him that ropes meant safety, not pain. I'll never forget watching you finally lead him using just that rope, the trust in his eyes. Every horse taught me something, Dalton said thoughtfully. Patience, mostly. Understanding that healing takes time and pushing too fast only causes more damage. That applied to more than just horses. You were always patient with me, Willow said softly. Even when I was stubborn or scared or pushing you away because I was afraid of losing you. And you were always honest with me, Dalton replied. Even when the truth was hard. That's what made us work. We never pretended with each other. We were always real, always genuine. As their 51st year of marriage progressed, they settled into a comfortable routine. Mornings were slow, drinking coffee on the porch and watching the ranch wake up around them. They still helped with small tasks. Willow tended her extensive garden, growing vegetables and herbs that she shared generously with family and neighbors, while Dalton worked with horses that needed a gentle hand, though he left the more physically demanding training to younger men. Their afternoons were often spent with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, teaching them the old stories, passing down the family history. Willow continued her writing, now working on a second volume that focused on the broader history of Colorado settlement and the changing West. Dalton whittled, creating small wooden horses that he gave to each child who visited, each one unique and carefully crafted. Evenings remained their special time, just the two of them on the porch, watching the sun set and the stars emerge, talking or sitting in the comfortable silence of two people who had spent a lifetime learning to read each other's moods and needs. When Dalton turned 72, he finally admitted what Willow had already guessed: his joints ached in the mornings, and his breathing was sometimes labored. They made the trip to Denver to see a specialist, who confirmed that his lungs had never fully recovered from the pneumonia years before, and his heart was showing signs of strain. "How long?" Dalton asked bluntly. The doctor hesitated. "Impossible to say for certain. Could be years yet if you take care of yourself. Avoid stress, get plenty of rest, keep to a moderate routine." On the train ride home, Willow held Dalton's hand tight, fighting back tears. "I know what you're thinking," Dalton said gently. "But I'm not dead yet, and I don't intend to waste whatever time we have left being scared of the end. Willow's voice broke. "I can't imagine life without you." "You won't have to for a good while yet," Dalton said firmly. "And when that time does come, you'll be surrounded by family and love and every good thing we built together. You'll be all right, Willow. You're the strongest person I know." "I was only strong because I had you beside me," Willow whispered. "No," Dalton said, turning her face to look at him. "You were strong long before I came along. You just needed someone to remind you of it sometimes. That's what partners do. Despite the doctor's warnings, Dalton continued to live fully. He still worked with horses, though he chose his projects more carefully. He still spent time with his family, delighting in watching his great-great-grandchildren take their first steps and speak their first words. He and Willow still sat on their porch every evening, still talked and laughed and loved each other with the same intensity they had from the beginning. Their 55th anniversary came and went, marked by a quiet family dinner rather than a large celebration. Their 60th anniversary was similar. They were both in their 80s now, moving slower but still sharp-minded and engaged with the world around them. Willow had never stopped being grateful for each day they had together. She found herself sometimes just watching Dalton as he slept or worked or talked with their grandchildren, memorizing the lines of his face, the sound of his voice, the gentle strength of his hands. She wanted to remember everything, to carry every detail with her if a day came when memories were all she had left. But that day seemed far away still. Dalton remained active and engaged well into his 80s, defying the doctor's predictions and his own body's limitations through sheer force of will and love of life. He always said it was because he had too much to live for, too many reasons to keep going. When Dalton was 86 and Willow 82, they made one final trip up to the ridge where the wild Mustang had first appeared all those decades ago. It took them most of the morning to make the climb, stopping frequently to rest, but neither complained. When they finally reached the top and looked out over the valley, over the ranch they had built and the life they had created, the effort felt worth it. "This is where I first saw him," Willow said, pointing to the spot. Standing right there against the sunrise, looking like he'd been carved from the morning mist itself. "And I was down there," Dalton said, pointing to a spot further down the ridge, tracking him, thinking I knew what I was doing, completely unprepared for what I was about to find. "What did you find?" Willow asked, though she knew the answer. "Everything," Dalton said simply. "Home, purpose, love, everything that made life worth living." They stood there for a long time, arms around each other, looking out over the land they loved. The ranch below looked smaller from this height, but no less precious. They could see figures moving around the buildings, their family, carrying on the work, continuing the legacy. "It will go on after us," Willow said softly. "Everything we built, everything we created, it will continue." "That's what immortality really means," Dalton agreed. "Not living forever yourself, but creating something that does. We did that, Willow. Whatever else happens, we did that." The descent was slower than the climb, and by the time they reached the ranch house, both were exhausted. But it was a good exhaustion, the kind that comes from doing something meaningful one last time. They spent that evening on the porch as always, but there was a sense of completion to it, a feeling that they had closed a circle begun more than 60 years ago. Dalton passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 months later, at the age of 87. He went to bed beside Willow as he had for more than 60 years, kissed her good night, told her he loved her, and simply did not wake in the morning. Willow held his hand as the sun rose, tears streaming down her face, but she also felt a deep peace. He had not suffered, had not lingered in pain or confusion. He had lived fully until the very end and gone gently into that final rest. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of death such a good life deserved. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Colorado family, friends, neighboring ranchers, people whose horses Dalton had trained or helped over the years. They told stories about his patience, his kindness, his revolutionary approach to horse training that had influenced a generation of horsemen. But the stories Willow treasured most were the ones from their children and grandchildren, talking about how Dalton had always made time for them, had always listened, had always believed in them. "He taught me that strength comes from gentleness," Samuel said during the eulogy. "That real power is having the ability to hurt something but choosing kindness instead. He taught me how to be a good man by being one himself every single day." After the funeral, Willow moved through the days in a haze of grief and memory. The ranch continued around her life did not stop for death. Animals still needed feeding and fences still needed mending. Her family surrounded her, making sure she ate and slept and did not slip too far into sorrow, but the evenings were hardest. She still went to the porch at sunset, but sitting there alone felt wrong in a fundamental way. The silence where Dalton's voice should be was an actual physical ache. One evening about a week after the funeral, Willow was sitting on the porch watching the sun set when she saw movement on the ridge. She stood slowly, shading her eyes, and her breath caught. There on the ridge stood a gray horse, not the original Mustang. He had been gone for decades, but clearly one of his descendants. The horse was the same shade of storm cloud gray, had the same proud bearing, the same wild spirit evident in every line of his body. He stood there against the setting sun, silhouetted like a ghost or a memory, and Willow felt something shift in her chest. The horse tossed his head once as if in acknowledgement or farewell, and then turned and disappeared over the ridge. Willow stood there long after he was gone, tears streaming down her face, but they were not entirely tears of sadness. There was something else too, a sense of rightness, of circles completing, of wild things returning to wild places while leaving their mark on the domestic world behind. Willow lived another 4 years, surrounded by family and staying active on the ranch until the very end. She finished her second book and started a third, determined to capture every memory, every lesson, every piece of wisdom she and Dalton had gathered over their years together. She remained sharp-minded and engaged, holding great-great-great-grandchildren and delighting in watching the family tree continue to branch and grow. She never remarried or even considered it. As she told her children when they gently suggested she might find companionship, she had already had the great love of her life. Nothing could compare to what she and Dalton had shared, and she was content to live with those memories rather than try to replace them. On what would have been their 65th anniversary, Willow went to bed in the room she had shared with Dalton, wearing one of his old shirts that still smelled faintly of him. She fell asleep thinking about the wild Mustang on the ridge, the young cowboy who had followed it to her fence, and the life they had built from that single moment of fate and choice. She passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 86, and the family liked to believe that she had gone to find Dalton, that somewhere beyond this world they were together again, sitting on a porch watching the sun set over wild country, with a gray Mustang running free on the ridge above them. The ranch continued under Samuel's ownership and eventually passed to his children and then to their children. The methods Dalton had developed for gentling horses became standard practice throughout the West. His book reprinted multiple times and translated into several languages. His legacy lived on not just in his descendants, but in the countless horses who benefited from his patient, respectful approach. Willow's writings became treasured historical documents, studied by scholars interested in early Colorado settlement and the changing West. But more than that, they became beloved family heirlooms, read and reread by each new generation, keeping the story of the wild Mustang and the cowboy alive. The original ranch house still stood 100 years later, carefully maintained by the family, with the porch where Willow and Dalton had spent so many evenings still offering the same view of the mountains and the ridge beyond. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light was just right, Visitors swore they could see a gray Mustang standing on that ridge, proud and wild and free, watching over the land below with the same intensity that had first brought him to a fence line more than a century before. It was a love story written in the language of the Wild West, not soft or easy, but fierce and real and enduring. It was a story of how kindness can tame wildness without destroying it, how patience can build something stronger than force ever could, how two people can come together by chance and create something that lasts for generations. And it all started with a wild Mustang leading his mare straight to her fence line, and a cowboy who followed and never left. A beginning that led to a love story that echoed through time, proving that the best kinds of love are the ones that respect freedom while choosing togetherness, that honor wildness while building home, that lasts not just a lifetime but forever.